We did our policy on drug decriminalization, a public health policy. So basically, our policy includes a couple of parameters. We're going to decriminalize all illicit drugs, which includes meth, amphetamine, cocaine, marijuana, etc. Instead of putting people in jail, we will be offering treatment programs, voluntary treatment programs, and possibly small fines. We will release current inmates for drug charges, or at least nonviolent drug charges, and still continue to prosecute trafficking of drugs in criminal court, including drug dealers. Now you will hear from my colleague, Chris.
In the year 1971, President Richard Nixon created a task force with the purpose of finding out the root causes of drug addiction, which was seen as an epidemic amongst many sections of the American people. The task force was comprised of youths and adults, and these are the findings. We acknowledge that drug abuse is largely a symptom of the individual's inability to cope with his immediate personal environment. However, it must be understood that deep societal ills increase the individual's sense of personal alienation. Specifically, our society has permitted the perpetuation of the Indochina War, of institutional and personal racism, of the pollution of our environment, and of urban crises. If the administration is sincere in its concern with drug abuse, it must deal aggressively with the root cause as well as implement the recommendations contained herein. So written were the findings of the task force. President Richard Nixon, however, recognized that it would be easier to enforce punitive measures such as fines and especially incarceration to deal with drug problems afflicting Americans, much easier than to look at structural causes. Drug users were criminal. That was the idea behind starting the federal war on drugs. The goal, as was recognized at the time, was to create a sideshow, a distraction from the true causes of drug abuse and societal ills, a deeply unequal society. Convinced Americans were then led to believe that drugs and drug addicts were doing what they did because it was a weakness of theirs. It was totally a personal choice, and they needed to pull themselves up by the bootstraps and stop using. Therefore, punishment is seen as a necessary thing to do to these criminals. This is in contrast to the overwhelming medical research and scientific research which recognizes that drug addiction is an illness. It is a medical condition. It is a disease like any other. And indeed, 1/3 of drug addicts have depression also, or another mental illness. So it is a disease. It is an illness, and that is the overwhelming consensus agrees. However, we are still left with this flawed idea of drug addicts as criminals. As a result of this flawed concept and policy, Americans now are number one in the world for most incarcerated citizens per capita. This affects a disproportionate amount of African Americans and other minorities, as well as the poor. For example, it is estimated that about 2.8 million children have an incarcerated parent. 1 in 9 African American children have a parent in prison, the majority of which were convicted of very minor drug offenses, nonviolent drug offenses. In some states, it's even worse. In certain individual states, the rate of African Americans incarcerated compared to Caucasians is 57 times greater incarceration for drug offenses. In spite of all the lives that have been ruined by jail, families that have been torn apart, the rate of drug addiction has been stagnant, as seen by the chart located within our PowerPoint presentation, which is listed as results. The rate of drug addiction has remained the same throughout this entire enforcement, and in the process, millions of lives have been ruined. $1.5 trillion have been spent, all for promoting a proven false policy that drug addiction should be punished, is a criminal offense. In contrast, in Portugal, as they explained, they were fighting the American way. They said for a quarter of a century they made drug use illegal, and it wasn't working out for them. They had a very high rate of deaths from overdose, very high addiction overall, and it was a disaster. In 2001, they decided to go about a different route that ends up being more scientifically factual as well. They decided to decriminalize drug use. At the same time, drug smugglers and drug dealers were still sentenced to prison if convicted. But individual drug users were not seen as criminals anymore. The government decided to subsidize treatment for addicts so that they could get help and get better if they needed and wanted to. As a result of this, deaths from drug overdose in Portugal is now one of the lowest in all of Europe, when before it was a huge problem. Furthermore, law-abiding citizens who are nonviolent, pose no threat to others, who happen to engage in drugs at times, they don't have to go to jail just for having this lifestyle choice. The policy of decriminalization has worked out very well for Portugal, and our goal is to bring that policy to the United States and to finally end the deeply flawed, unscientific, catastrophic for families war on drugs. Now my colleague Adrian will continue.
So, now I'm going to talk about how this affects families. So, to begin, you have to look at the ever-widening net that's cast by the current drug laws and see that, for the most part, these are affecting women. So, sentencing laws fail to consider the many reasons that women go out of their way to not only remain quiet, but also not report their partners who are either drug dealing or even just using drugs in general. And sentences for women also tend to either be equal or even harsher for those that are imposed on the principals that are in the drug trade. Now, who loses out most? Children do. Children, for the most part, are threatened by the removal from their immediate family, and also find the threat of placement in a child welfare system that can not always be good for the child, especially with the separation from the parents. And when looking at the disparity that there is between women and men, you see that women, 65% of the women incarcerated in state prison report that they have a minor, and compared to the 55% of their male counterparts. Another statistic to look at is the number of minor children whom have a father that are in prison. That rose 58% from 1991 to 1999, compared to the 98% increase from others during that same time period. And according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 9 out of the 10 fathers in state prison report that their children are still living with a parent, whereas women, 1 in 4, but more specifically 28% of mothers in prison say that their child's father is their current caregiver. And this demonstrates that when mothers are incarcerated, children are more likely to go into kinship care or foster care. And going away from how families are affected by the incarceration of mothers, another thing to look at is what it does to the incarceration of men. So cutting down on the number of men in prison for drug-related offenses has indirect economic benefits. By keeping these men in their communities, an issue that was actually recognized as early as 1988, systematic poverty can be cut down on, as it's linked to the fractured communities that have been torn apart by the drug war. Allowing these men to remain within their families can help them economically participate within their communities and contribute to the society as a whole. Opening the prison doors is one of the first things that would help, as it would be a good start to solving the problem of entrenched poverties among communities of color in the United States. And it's also worth noting that poor communities are themselves an economic drain, requiring more government support and stronger safety nets because they are unable to support themselves. And in actuality, putting the money into these sort of government supports would be a better use than having to pay for the maintenance of these otherwise men and women in prisons. And now to give this back to Olivia.
Okay, so basically our audience includes harmless, nonviolent drug users. Over 50% of inmates in federal prison are for drug offenses. 1 in every 28 children or 3.6% of children have a parent in jail. So this is going to result in children growing up in foster care, being homeless, or just going through the government system without parents. So while 1 in every 28 children has a parent in jail, 1 in every 9 black children have a parent in jail, so it goes way up. Our audience also includes, like, non-directly families, children, wives, mothers, daughters, husbands, wives, etc., who've been afflicted by a drug-using family member. So an alternative path, Chris has already discussed this quite thoroughly, but Portugal in 2001 decriminalized drugs, and they had great success with it 14 years later. The statistics are really good. There's been a drastic reduction in addicts. Portuguese officials say that drug addicts have halved in the following 10 years. Like he mentioned, overdoses have gone down, which also STDs have gone down. So overall, it's just been a really successful policy. A lot of people believe that's because they focused on rehabilitation. And while you can see in the statistics that the people who were drug users, like, that's helped them, it's also so many families have been helped as well. So the chart shows that there's been a decrease in amphetamines, cocaine, cannabis, and that's probably a result from the increased, like, availability of treatment. So basically our policy intent is to reduce nonviolent drug offenders in prison and jail, which are just taking up money and space. Promote health treatment for afflicted individuals. So instead of using the money towards putting those people in jail who aren't causing any harm to society, using that money towards health treatment for them. And then in general, create a healthier mentally and physically society in helping all the people who are going to be indirectly affected by this policy and allowing their family members to get treatment. So the implications would be a happier, more stable life for children, family, and hopefully the drug addicts themselves.